So a second way of thinking about culture that Spillman talked about in her reading was kind of on the next page from the anthropological view, was what I call kind of the bourgeois concept of culture. And so what do I mean by this? So in 18th or 19th century England, there became, as class structures began to develop and solidify due to the Industrial Revolution of the late 1700s, early 1800s, there became a process by which upper classes tried to distinguish themselves, and we're going to talk a lot more about this later in the semester, distinguish their who they were as individuals and as a group from the rest of society. And so we see the introduction of this word culture based on the word cultivation. So culture, and you can even think of this if any of you are in the medical field or have had strep throat, you'll hear people say, I'd like to take a culture from your throat, put a swab in the back of your throat, and they're taking a culture. Well, that is actually the root of this concept of culture, which is culture was from the idea of cultivation, that there's a living organism that can be nurtured and grows in a certain natural process. And in the early 1800s, the bourgeoisie, so upper classes in England, began to use the word culture to refer to this possibility of a linear development by which you could rank groups of people according to their taste. Okay, and not surprisingly, the people using this term culture, they thought they had culture, so they put themselves up here at the top of that continuum, and they would reference down to kind of the poor, illiterate masses, this sort of thing, at the bottom of that continuum. And cultivation then was expressed by these cultured people by saying, what we need to do is develop human individuals, or cultivate human individuals, allow them to be better persons. What this really meant, kind of in the background of that, is being able to pick up on all these kind of extra activities, usually non-productive, non-economic activities that gave people taste and showed that they were quote-unquote good people or cultivated people. So these activities would include things like going to the correct plays, belonging to the right churches, dressing the right way with your corset in a certain way in the right color and fashion of the day, reading the correct books. And you start to see this separation by this group up here naming culture as the appropriate forms of all those things: books, plays, poems, churches. We have culture, and down here, these are uncultivated people because they don't share those things. And then you also start to see a system of kind of patriarchal helping of these individuals to make them more cultivated individuals and thereby kind of save them in both a religious sense and kind of a sense of wanting them to be better human beings. In this concept of culture, culture is separate from the material aspects of life. It's this realm of kind of supposedly the essence of human creativity and artist activity that can only be achieved through cultivation and slow, careful development. And so if you lacked culture, if you didn't find yourself in this category up here with all the correct taste, then you were ignorant. Or people would say, and people still say this today too, oh, they're so uncultured. Or that's uncouth, or oh, they totally lack culture. When we say that today, it's actually referring back to this era in which there's this idea of a high realm of human activity, which is culture, and people down here are uncultivated and need to be brought into that realm. So in many ways, it became a way of having social distinction, and as we'll talk about later in the course, that power that's created by claiming some activities as elite and defining us as better humans is a real social power that we'll talk quite a bit more about as we go on. All right, let me move to the next one. Now I'm painting with a broad brush on these things. Spillman backs me up a little bit, but it's important you understand that the ways we often talk about culture have these deep meanings. So then let me give you kind of the quick 1-2 in the 20th century how sociologists have thought about culture? Well, to confuse you more, we basically ditched culture. Mid-20th century social scientists, sociologists in particular, increasingly tried to adopt a model of science which we would call the experimental or natural science method of science, in which deductive methods and ways of thinking could help us to reduce the elements of life to their most basic causes. And for sociologists, often these most basic causes were material causes. So sociological thinking, particularly in the first 70 years of the 20th century, was kind of defined by looking at something that we might call culture, say somebody, some set of beliefs or opinions that people have, or some artistic activity, or the way people think about their lives. And they would say, you know what, if we look closely at it enough and analyze society, we can reduce those things, those soft cultural things, and see that actually underneath them all are material forces of society. So these material forces would be things such as organizations, class interest, income, power, things like this. And what sociologists tried to do during this time was basically find kind of universal laws to explain human activity, and to kind of push culture to the side and say human activity is driven by the material, concrete aspects of life and power. Ran into a problem eventually, though, because right around the mid-20th century, this quite famous sociologist, you may have heard of him, Talcott Parsons, tried to bring it all together. What he tried to do was bring these kind of materialistic ideas of sociological explanation together with the way people think, what people believe, how people have meaning in their life, and he jammed it all together into this really almost beautiful system of explanation. As we figured out by about the 1960s, though, this system of explanation was completely doomed, because in Parsons' explanation of society, he came up with this idea that culture was really kind of two things at the same moment. One, that if you and I are little humans walking around in the world, we've got two things going on. One, we've got this whole system of culture that grabs us, that holds us together, and defines exactly kind of the purposes of our action and what we can do. But simultaneously, that big thing out there, culture, for Parsons, was inside of us. So he would look at, say, a criminal and say, well, the problem with that criminal is they're not appropriately assimilated or integrated to the culture. So they don't have the culture, they don't have culture appropriately settled inside of them to connect with the cultural world outside of them. And so it was almost, you could almost think of kind of an earth magnetic system of this, in which culture was two things. It was both the poles, so the North and South Pole, that orient the magnetic field of Earth, and it was also a magnetic compass inside of individuals. And it had this strange power over individuals through the abstract values to orient us towards the things that we were supposed to do and the way that social life was supposed to happen. So he argued that culture kind of had these two components, this all-encompassing big component, and then this internalized inside of us. And so culture in this sense was kind of abstract. It was hard to really get a sense of what he meant by culture. And it was this kind of uniform glue that supposedly was there. It was hard to explain where it came from. It didn't seem, in his theory, to kind of change that much. It was just a part of everything. One problem with talking about culture that way is that it makes it this entity that kind of explains everything, but at the same time explains nothing. Because when you build a definition of culture that that is kind of everywhere at all times, without any kind of clear idea about where it came from or where it's going or how you and I interact with it, then you end up with kind of a blah definition that actually doesn't do much work for helping us understand what happens in the social world. Intriguingly, and this might help you understand this a little bit, this concept socialization, which I can guarantee you've heard of in your life and you've used before, actually is from Parsons. And that word, what that means, socialization, is the social project of getting individuals integrated into this big thing that we call culture, and then living correctly, behaving correctly, doing the right thing. And so in Parsons' view, we could say, oh, people who are different or do the wrong thing aren't socialized appropriately, right? Their compasses haven't been oriented correctly to this thing out there, this abstract culture. As you no doubt know, this concept of socialization is a big one in sociology. But for the sociology of culture, this was a big problem because, as I've said, it tried to explain everything, but by trying to explain everything, didn't explain too much at all. So by the 1960s, Parsons' system is attacked by sociologists, and really today I'm getting my doctorate in sociology, and I've only read a little bit of Parsons. He was the great leading light of all sociologists in the mid-20th century, and nobody reads him anymore. So this one massive attempt by sociologists to bring material parts of life and culture together, in the end, actually failed. So then how do we get to where we are today? Well, there are a couple things, and so we could call this sociology and culture today. In the last 30 years, there's really been a revolution in sociology. The section of the American Sociological Association that studies culture, which I'm a member of, is actually the biggest and has been the fastest growing section in all of the American Sociological Association, despite the fact that literally 30 years ago it didn't exist. And so sociology has really gone through a transformative revolution over the last 30 years of saying this thing, culture, that we either ignored in our early days or that Parsons did a really poor job of dealing with, there's something to this idea of culture and we need to revisit it. And there were a number of forces that caused us to kind of look again at culture and to try and work with it. We realized that looking at just material aspects of society can't explain everything. There were decades in the 1960s and 70s in particular, and even today, lots of social movements that were combating mainstream culture and trying to throw off the bonds of oppression by when they were being told that the color that they are, or the gender that they are, or the sexuality that they are, they were being kind of told by social forces that was less than mainstream, and that they shouldn't have the rights or shouldn't be able to participate in culture as everybody else. And as sociologists, when we study these movements, we see that, wow, these people are doing amazing things with understanding themselves, understanding the world, critiquing the way the world works. Boy, there's a lot of culture that's involved in that sort of activity. So by the late 1970s, early 1980s, you really saw sociologists start to revisit the concept of culture. And as I've said now, it's been kind of 30 years of no looking back, of really using or investigating what we mean by culture and the role it plays in the social world. So let me pause here for a second. I'll come back. I'll walk you through this definition, say a few things about the syllabus, and then we'll be done.